Hello and welcome to Nailing It Down, a short explainer series here on Varnblog. And you can see I'm in my new recording studio, which is my general office, and the move has happened, um, which is why this video has been delayed. There's also been some improvements in lighting equipment and whatnot, and hopefully that helps out here. We don't want to ruin our lo-fi aesthetic, however. Um, just remind you guys how this works. Nailing It Down is where I answer a question for my patrons over on my Patreon. You can find the link in all kinds of places, and I include some links to help you understand what we are talking about. This is an extension of a little show I used to do over at Zero Books 2.0 before it was bought by Wackus Media, although this ended before then, where I would go into concepts, but now I answer questions. And this question comes from a patron who asked me what I meant when I talked about the efficiency versus brittleness equations or models. This is a talking point in cybernetics theory. It's a talking point in complex systems theory, but it comes actually out of just basic physics and the development of systems. And I, being more schooled in anthropology and biology, will use biological examples as well as mechanical ones, and then we'll talk about the problems with these models. Also, roadmap for you some concepts that are going to come up: Deleuze and Guattari's ribosomic organization, the problems with that, simple versus complex systems, and cascade failure. So, to understand though, we have to define our terms, and so our terms here start with brittleness and efficiency. Efficiency is the ratio of useful work performed by a machine or a system or a process uh, in regards to the total energy expended or heat taken in. Now, this seems very physical, like an efficient machine will get the most work or do the most action for the least amount of energy put in it, but there's always energy loss. Um, so, how do you make something more efficient? Now, this is very simple in simple system design, such as a mechanistic um, lever or any kind of small, simple machine. It gets way more complicated when you start looking at social systems in regards to their energy efficiency and what we even mean by that. But we apply efficiency to social systems all the time. After all, capitalist efficiency is about profitability, where you can increase the amount of work and thus the amount of product you can get and exploit by in regards to the amount of energy and inputs put in. So the most efficient systems are the most profitable because they extract the most from labor. And other theories of economics will say other things about what's going on there, but I think that's basically the truth. Um, so a highly efficient system will get the most for the least work. This leads to all kinds of things. Um, But we have to be careful when we talk about social systems this way because there are different kinds of energy inputs that go into this kind of system. So there's no way that it's ever simple. Now, let's contrast that with the definition of brittleness. Brittleness comes from material science as well, although it is applied to systems theory too. Um, so, a material or a system is brittle when it is subjected to stress. It fractures with little elastic deformations or without plastic deformations, meaning that it cannot adjust to the um, stress point. Brittle materials absorb little energy. Now, this seemingly doesn't relate to one another until you start thinking about the design of simple systems. So, brittleness often is directly related to the concept of cascade failure. And cascade failure is when a node in a chain or a system fails, other failures start to compound. Now, the reason why brittleness and cascade failure are directly related is related to simple systems. So imagine uh, you're developing an organic organism and you need a efficient use of your energy. Um, there are going to be systems you're going to make that are redundant, but there are some systems that are necessary that are that use up so much energy, brain, heart, for example, in a human, that you don't have a whole lot of redundant capacity because your body would require too many calories, too much energy expenditure to maintain the redundant system. Okay, fine. We can think about this in terms of plants too, or in terms of a worm. A worm is a very efficient system. It's basically one tube. And if those things can be separated and survive, it isn't given to cascade failure. But if it can't, it is. Think about this as nodes on a chain. A chain that has multiple redundant points uses more energy. It just has more things it has to keep going. We can get to complications in this later, but an efficient centralized one won't. It has exactly the right amount of nodes in a directly linked chain, so it doesn't tend to be given to large amounts of energy loss. Yes, it's going to lose some because entropy always applies, but it's not going to lose a ton. Now, you might go, what does this have to do with communism or cybernetics or anything like that, Derek? Well, it has to do with what you think centralization is for. Historically speaking, communists, going all the way back to Marx and Engels, refuting kinds of confederationism, have pointed out that highly confederated systems can't make decisions because they're basically inefficient in both their deliberative processes. They can't move quickly, and thus their energy cannot be converted into speed, but also in terms of like there's a lot of energy trying to achieve unity that's lost in a more centralized system where centralization basically functions as the efficiency model. The issue with this, and there's a couple of issues with this. One, as I mentioned, in a complex system, there's all kinds of things that can be centralized that may not actually be the same function and may have different kinds of energy or energy expenditures going into it. And we can get in that when you talk about, say, the executive of the United States is increasingly centralized, but it is not more efficient. And in fact, it's actually an overly complex klug given to massive amounts of loss because within the seeming centralization, there's enough subcomponents that have different functions and maybe redundant functions, or at least highly disorganized and disunified functions that, despite the seeming appearance on one level of efficiency, i.e., more things in one form of government that has a singular head, um, you know, there is massive amounts of inefficiency throughout its systemic accumulation because they're basically a bunch of functions that have been absorbed by the executive that are not ran really in the same way. So that's one complicated example. And so a centralization here wouldn't lead to efficiency anyway. But most of the time, let's say it does. You get a simple system, you simplify your hierarchy, or you simplify your command chain. So let's even remove the idea of a hierarchy from this. And you have very linear centralized functions. Well, what's the problem? A highly centralized system, like a highly centralized organism, is given to massive cascade failure. Now, interestingly enough, as the system dynamics and stuff like catastrophe theory was developing in the 60s and 70s, kind of concurrently to it, the two post-Marxist, calling them post-Marxist may be unfair, but one of them was not a Marxist. Guattari is a little bit more complicated. Luz and Guattari start positing that the hyper-centralization of the systems in communism were a mistake, and that a rhizomatic model would be more useful. Now, This we have to go back to these various organic models. A highly centralized, say, think of plants. The taproot plant is very efficient. It gets its roots from a tap. If that tap gets its roots, it can bloom up forward. It's a simplified, streamlined system with a simple root. But if anything happens to the taproot, that plant dies. That is a singular teleologically oriented plant in philosophical terms. It is oriented towards one system. That system is efficient as to get sunlight and energy, and it gets nutrients from its taproot. It does so in a streamlined manner, so it can often produce a lot. You can do a lot of blooms with it. It might even have redundant heads, but its base is one centralized organism. Compare that to grass. Grass does not have a central taproot system. It has a diffuse set of roots that sprout out in all kinds of directions, and pulling up one or two nodes of glass will not kill the basic plant because it does not have a centralized organic structure. It has a bunch of nodes. So Deleuze and Guattari argue that, part of how capitalism works is the deterritorializing and this ribosomic spreading, where you can cut off, any number of nodes in the system, but the basic system will still survive. And they are basically making a comparison to grass. It's a biological, structural, analogous form to biology. But the problem with this, is this only works when you're thinking about the metaphor if you assume there's no agency involved. Neither taproot dandelions nor grass need to coordinate any function that requires even complex coordination in any way, but that's not true for any animal. Animals have various degrees of complexity of nervous system. I mean, a human being is a complex system. For example, you're more than one thing. So the answer to the brittleness equation, which again, brittleness comes because cascade failure can happen. You see failures in multiple points of node, a highly centralized system. If a part of the chain breaks down, the entire chain breaks down. Just think about it in links of a chain. If you cut that chain in the middle, it falls apart. That would be ideally a highly centralized system. Now, I haven't gone into a lot of what I need to go into. There's stuff about energy sinks. There's all kinds of problems with this. One, as we keep on mentioning in this, there's different kinds of complexity involved. And there's some kinds of energy inputs going into the system. Yes, ultimately, all energy is just the energy absorbed from heat and thus moved around, even in people. But the way that is manifested and used in a complicated system and society is a complex of complicated systems, you can see how this analogy starts to break down. Furthermore, there are ways to achieve relative efficiency while not expending the same amount of energy as maintaining fully redundant systems at all times. I mean, ideally, that would be, if you have infinite energy, you can do that. And you can think about over efficiency even in capitalism. Let's look at the COVID crisis. There was an input to make hospitals as efficient, get it down to the average number of beds maintained in an area and the staff to maintain it. Well, if there's a crisis, that all of a sudden becomes a problem and you have cascade failure, because not just does the crisis break itself, it also breaks other parts of the medical chain, which is why everybody was talking about, reduce the pressure on the hospital, so this, that, and the other. But there's also this counter pressure in capitalism in particular to get that down to the most efficient allocation of resources. So there was all these laying off of nurses and moving them around and this, that, and the other to try to maintain this efficiency. And there was a general lack of hospital beds for emergency purposes, although not the catastrophic ones that we could have had over a prolonged period of time. Now, this can all seem very confusing because I'm not drawing diagrams for you, but I want you to think about this. Would it have been more efficient to do what the hospitals did? Would it have been worth the cost of a small amount of energy to go against brittleness? So what do I mean by that? Well, why don't you have more hospital beds, but not run them not run them most of the time. You don't staff them, you don't have them ready, but you have them ready to go if you need them. So you have them dormant. You do have to expend some amount of energy to maintain them as a dormant system, but when they're needed, they come on. And actually, if you think about this biologically, there's all kinds of systems like that. Plus, there are moderately low energy systems for whatever reason that we have two of. Think about eyes, think about kidneys, think about lungs. You can lose one. You're going to be less efficient. You're not going to work optimally, but you will survive. So even in a highly centralized system like us, and I mean that literally like us as people, as a biological being, we still see evidence of some redundant systems. And there's all kinds of this even in the history of biology. We don't evolve to be the absolute most efficient thing. We evolve to be the most survivable thing, which is going to have both efficiency and brittleness acquired into it. Now, this may all seem very abstract to you, and that's fine, but it does mean that when you're designing social systems, you have to deal with the fact that certain kinds of centralizations may appear more efficient, but will be more brittle. There are ways to adjust for that. Stronger social bonds, which is kind of like tactile strength. It's like an analogous to tactile strength. Having systems that are not high energy or don't require a lot of coordination be redundant, like in a ribosomatic fashion, but realizing that total ribosomatic planning isn't planning. You can't plan that way. Plants don't plan. They just kind of develop out in fractal patterns. Particularly the ribosomic ones. And so a lot of the debates about centralization versus non-centralization has to be taken in the context of the kinds of energy you're wanting to keep and what kind of work you want it to do. And centralization can still be hyper complex because you can be centralizing multiple different functions that need completely different energy resources. Think about, I don't know, in humans, think about genitalia. They have two functions that are not really related and have a lot of energy tied into both. One is waste excretion and one is reproduction. It's always made me wonder about many things about biology, why that happened that way. But the reason why those systems overlap is it's seemingly biologically efficient, and at least in mammals, for them to do so. And yet it does cause all kinds of problems and failures, etc. But they're not problems and failures that generally kill the organism. And so it doesn't lead to cascade failure. Cascade failure is like, but if my heart dies, I have cascade failure. You see this spread throughout the system. Like I said, I was going to use biological analogies. A lot of these actually come out of mechanical physics, but the difference between mechanical physics and biology are levels of complexity and intentionality. All right. Organic things developed stochastically, at least until a certain point of consciousness is achieved, which makes it sound like I have a teleological origin towards consciousness. I don't know that I do, but I do think you have to admit that like evolution is not a clear planned progress. Planned progress. 99% of all organisms are inefficient, are brittle, and they die. And mutations tend to lead towards brittleness or non-viability or maladaptation. But the ones that survive through natural selection are maintained. But there are other forms of selection in complex beings too. I mean, there's sexual selection, for example, and social selection. And we have to think about ourselves in these kinds of systems. So this is my rambling answer about the tension between brittleness and efficiency and centralization. Centralization reduces redundant systems if it's truly centralized on a clear, purpose where everything is actually made into unified functions. Now, if they're centralized and they don't have unified functions, that centralization benefit is lost. But brittleness can come because overly centralized systems have very little they can lose. There's no redundancy. So if something fails, it cascades throughout the system. Now, that's not the only thing that causes system brittleness. There are other things that can cause that. And that's beyond the purview of a 20-minute explainer. And I already feel like I've been rambling because this is kind of hard to explain. One thing I'm going to tell you is check out the physics and biology and TED Talks and stuff I'm listing in here. There's a lot of different concepts and ideas that I'm pulling from this. And if you can do some math, it's going to be useful for you to go through the research I've included in the basic definitions. We'll talk about the implications of this more in the future, but this is part of systems design. If you're designing a social system, can you handle the tension between its use of energy and whether or not its net energy loss is unsustainable and its brittleness? All right. And there's always a tension there. Right? This is not some principle that is a social principle. This is a mathematical tension. It's just kind of inherent to the way energy works. All right. So I hope that helps you understand what I was getting at in those systems. This is a far more basic thing than talking about the normal history of communism stuff that we often do here. So I hope that